Hi, I'm Jennifer Fairbanks, and today I'm going to be walking you through a sew-along for the new Loftus Bralette. So let's take a look at the table at what we're about ready to make. For this sew-along, we're going to be making a lace overlay for the Loftus Bralette using our 2-inch wide silver elastic. And there is an internal power bar that is between the layers of the lining and the self. To begin our sew-along, we need to have all of our pattern pieces. So I have all of mine taped together and I have them all lined up. And I want to separate them based on the fabric that we're going to be cutting them out of. So these two pieces, we cut 2 out of power mesh or power net. And so I'm going to set these 2 to the side because we're going to deal with our lining first. So looking over here, we have this one we have to cut 4 of lining. We have to cut 2 of the lining, 2 of the main fabric. This one is also 2 lining and 2 main, as well as this one. So I will be cutting these 3 pieces out of some really pretty pink lace. And then I'm going to be cutting all 4 of these pieces out of my lining fabric. And I'm also going to keep some tailor's chalk handy so we can mark either where our notches are or where we have these circles so we can line them up a little bit easier when we go to sew them. I'm going to set that to the side and get my lining fabric. So we're going to need to cut this pattern up and also down. And the best way to do this is to actually cut each piece individually. So I'm just going to line them up. We want to make sure that our grain lines follow our selvage. So we're going to line this up and I'm going to get my ruler just to kind of get things, making sure I have them parallel to that selvage. And then I can work on getting everything else lined up. We want to conserve the fabric where we can because who knows, maybe you'll be able to get a second bra out of this fabric. Maybe, maybe not. And so I'm going to use this one over here. And then we have these pieces as well. So these are, we can line our grain lines up to our other grain lines if your ruler is not long enough. And then this piece, we're going to actually have to cut 4 out of. And so double check at how you have the grain line on here. So I'm going to cut these off screen because you don't need me to show you how to cut. Just be careful that you are cutting right on your black lines. We don't want to be cutting too far away from them because it can make the pattern too big. And if we cut off too much of our black lines, it will make our pattern a little bit too small. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all of my lining pieces, and then we're going to come back and discuss cutting the lace. So I've gone ahead and cut out all of my lining pattern pieces, but I did not cut my notches. I wanted to come back and talk to you briefly about it. Now you can see we have little notches that come in about 1/8 of an inch, but our seam allowances on the entire bra are 1/4 of an inch. So if you accidentally cut a little bit too deep, we could end up ripping a hole in your garment. So the easiest way to kind of avoid that is, well, we can actually go in and mark with tailor's chalk, or we can mark with pins. You can do a tiny little snip with the edge of your scissors, just like right on the tip. But if you want to be careful, so you don't actually do any of that, let's just come in with a little bit of tailor's chalk. So I'm going to line this up. And so I've got one right here. And so I've got pink and I've also got white. I wasn't sure what would show up a little bit better. So we'll try a little bit of both and see if it has a little bit. And it may be easier for you to see the pink one. So I'm going to stick with the red and do that. So I'm marking in here. Now this will come off and I'm not too worried about it. So it's just chalk. You can also, if you're really, really careful, you can take a Sharpie or a pen and just mark the outside bit of seam allowance, like where the notch is. So we have that piece. Just getting them lined up. Okay. Over here at the tip, I'm just going to kind of fold that down so I can see exactly where that's going to be. That's going to be right there, kind of at that dip. So I'm kind of marking a little dot there. And then along this side, again, I'm going to mark my notches with the tailor's chalk. And of course, you're going to have to be careful when you're actually working on these, because as you start sewing it together, well, tailor's chalk can rub right off. So you just want to be careful. Try not to handle your pieces too much. Try not to cut it out and then sew it on a different day. Or if you do, just keep your pattern pieces lined up with it. So to make it easy for you to just double check that you've got everything still lined up. Okay, and then we can do the opposite over here. So I'm going to go in and mark on all of my pieces the wrong side. So if you have all of the right side facing up, then you want to flip them over and mark the wrong sides. So I'm going to just do that right now. So I'm just going to put kind of an X. This is going to indicate the wrong side of my fabric. And this is chalk. So it will rub off. If you don't want it to be this obvious and you're afraid the chalk won't come off, you can put a little piece of tape that indicates which is your right side and which is your wrong side. So I'm going to flip them back over. So now these are all prepped to start getting sewn together. But hey, we haven't actually touched our lace yet. So I'm going to carefully stack them in order so I can then stack them shortly with the lace piece. So I'm going to set these over to the side. I know I didn't do this piece yet because there are 4 of them. And the only thing we really need to mark is probably this little point right down here where they all join, which is about right there. So 2 are going to be for the outside. So two of them are going to behave as an outside layer, and 2 of them are going to behave as an inside layer. So I'm going to do that, and then we can just flip it. So you got that. As long as you have 2 in one direction and 2 in the other, we'll be good. So I'm just going to go ahead and set these aside because we don't need to cut anything else out of this one. We now have our lace. So this is a really pretty pink lace. And we have our selvage over here, white on screen. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out my first piece on all of these. And then when I'm done, I'm going to do a bit of a fussy cut. So I may end up having to switch them around because what I want to do is I want to match up my lace pattern from these in the reverse. So I'm going to cut these ones out and then I will show you how I'm going to line those up. Okay, so now what I'd like to do, so I've cut these pieces out and this is where it gets a little tricky. So I want to make sure that I have a right and a left. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but I am going to see if I can try and match my flowers up anywhere. And I think, oh, I can. Oh, that one's off the edge. So I'm going to have to find another flower that is the same pattern. Looks like that is right here. So this way it's going to allow me to have kind of a mirror image from left to right. Now this is very, very tricky because this lace may not be 100% symmetrical, but if we can get it close enough, it's going to look really nice when we're actually finished with it. So now I'm just now using my fabric that I already cut out, which might be a little bit tricky for you to see. Just cutting along the edge. And I'm using my pattern weight because it's a lot easier since pins like to move around. So if you don't have any pattern weights, you can use things that are laying around. You can use your phone, you can use a can of food, you can use a calculator. I have used all sorts of different things to use as pattern weights when trying to line them up. Okay, so now this piece is mirrored. This one here, this one's going to be a trickier one because it is the largest one. So let's see if we can get it in this direction. And there is a lot of waste that you end up having when cutting like this. So, you know, the fabric piece from this kit, there is a fair amount of it, but maybe tricky. That is not the same flower. So I'm going to have to, this looks like that flower is close enough to it. That's actually not a completely mirrored fabric. So we're going to get as close as we can for the desired effect. So it'll still look, fairly mirrored, even though it's not a pattern that we can actually duplicate exactly. So, but for the main part, and the main part of it, we have big flowers in about the same place. Some fabrics you get a little luckier than others. Some scissors you get a little luckier than others. And then I just have one more to match up. Okay, I'm looking at my back side, and that looks pretty close to this one. So you see there's a lot of waste with it, but it'll make for a really nice result. And if you're not too concerned about it, well, you can conserve your fabric and probably get 2 bras out of this kit. So then the only thing we have to do is the power net. So now our power net, we're going to line this up with this line going parallel to our selvage. And then we have this, and we're going to be cutting 2 of these. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these and then come back over here so we can start laying things out to begin sewing. So your power net has a bit of a roll, and so it's going to roll towards the back side. So I'm just going to go ahead and I am going to do my X's to indicate the wrong sides on each of these. The power net is going to be one of the last things we do, so I'm going to set that to the side. But I want to get my fabric and lining, oops, and I just dropped part of them. I'm going to get them all lined up so we can begin pinning and sewing. Okay, so there's my center pieces. This is also going to be a later thing, but I'm going to set mine up. And I want to just double check that I have these oriented in the correct direction, and I don't. These 2. Oops. Must have flipped those when I got them in there. So that's going to be there. This one is right here. And this one is right here. So marking the lace is going to be a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to line You want to make sure that you have space where you can have all of your pieces lined up at all times. So I'm going to look at my right sides of the lace, and you'll be able to see because it's shiny on one side and it's not shiny on the other. Of course, you may not be able to see it on the camera, but you should be able to see that one side's shiny and one side is not. If you're able to mark it with chalk where the side is that is not on the front, then we can go ahead and do that. I will line these up first and then I'll see if I can mark them. Okay, so these are all my right sides facing up. Let's see if I can give a, won't really be able to see that. Okay, I have a solution. Blue painter's tape. Should be easy to see. Okay, I'm going to stick a piece of tape on the back of the lace so we know which is the right and which is the wrong. Don't need a big piece. Oops, let me put this in the body. Okay, so I have my back sides and my front sides marked, and we're going to start pinning them together. We're going to pin our outsides together, and I like to do this as an efficient manner as possible so I can easily put pieces right back where I found them. So I'm going to start lining up my outside pieces first, but I want to make a note on this point right here. This first piece that gets attached up to this point. So on the pink fabric, it's a little bit harder to mark that. So I'm just going to take with a pin and indicate that with a pin on this piece. So we're going to start by lining up our right sides at the bottom. And then I'm going to line up, and you can see it's not quite at the tip. It's about 1/4 of an inch in and down, right where those line up. And if you have it marked in the right place, the rest should fit together perfectly. Okay, so there's piece number 1. I'm also going to do the same thing for my lining. So I'm going to line this up. So remember here I have actually that little chalk mark. So it's much easier to line it up with the lining piece. And so my right sides are going together. And you should see that the notches should line up, but like I said, don't get hung up on it because sometimes our markings are not perfect. They're there to more help you guide and make sure that things are lining up to the right pieces. Okay, so we got those 2 pieces pinned together. And we're going to leave this pattern piece here so we can see what we're doing. And then I'm going to come over to these 2 pattern pieces and do the same thing. So again, we need to make sure where this is, I have a pin indicating on the pink because it's just much harder to line up. I'm going to get this piece lined up right there. Okay, so now we have our outside pieces ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and set these over at the machine, and we're going to sew these seams at 1/4 of an inch. Now I want to make sure when I set them over on my table that they're in the same orientation. So I'm going to take my left pieces first, and then I'm going to take my right pieces and leave them in that orientation on my sewing machine table. Okay, so I have all my pieces lined up. And after I sew each piece, I'm going to put them back in the same orientation on my table so I don't get things flipped from right to left. So I'm going to be stitching with black thread so you can see my stitches. And we need to be sewing this at 1/4 of an inch. So my foot on my machine is closer to 3/8 of an inch. the foot width on most home machines is about 1/4 inch. So you can often use that foot as your guide when you're sewing. But double check, take your tape measure and measure from the center of the needle to the side of the foot to see if it is actually 1/4 inch. And if it is, you're perfect. If not, you're going to need to do probably some test stitching so you can figure out exactly where you need to line them up. So the first thing I'm going to do is not begin sewing that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with a starter piece of fabric. And we're doing this because we're working on a fabric that can easily get eaten inside your machine. So I'm just going to get this started. First, it's a good way to double check that we have the right stitch length. I think I have mine at about 2.5. I'm going to go about a 2 1/4, but that should be a good length for you. Some machines vary a little bit. You don't want a really long stitch, but you don't want something so small that if you end up having to seam rip, it's difficult to take out. So I am coming here to the edge of my fabric, and when I get to the end, I can then start sewing on this piece. And what this does is this helps pull the thread through the machine and pulls the fabric with it because it's already attached to the piece in the back. And that will allow it not to get eaten by your machine. So I am not doing a back stitch right here because that's more of a chance for it to get eaten by the machine. We are going to be doing several different stitches on this, so we can always go back and reinforce it, but between all these stitches we're going to be doing, you'll be able to secure that with those other stitches. So you see I also have this other tool that allows me to get in there so my fingers are not as close because I'm trying to line up the edges of my fabric. And the lace is a little tricky because the lace moves around quite a bit. And I really kind of wanted to have a smaller stitch around the lace anyways because the fibers are so small that they could easily poke through. So if you're working with an open lace like this, it may be worth having that slightly smaller stitch. Okay, I'm going to come all the way up to where they're joining, but I'm not going to sew all the way to the top. I'm just going to sew kind of right to where that point was. So it's about 1/4 inch in. Okay. I'm going to leave myself a little tail there. And we want to make sure that our seam is not puckering. So I can see mine's pulling a little bit. So if you leave yourself a little tail, we can kind of work some of that out because we don't want that seam to pucker. And I think that's fine. That's fine the way that is. I'm going to sew this one now. This one is not going to get eaten into the machine as much, but to play it safe, we can start with this. And you can see how lovely this stuff sews. It makes for a really nice opaque lining. Not all linings have to be sheer. Okay. I'm stopping where that chalk mark was. Give myself a little bit of a tail so I can make sure that that seam is going good. It looks like my tension's off a little bit. So my husband was on my machine, and so I think he may have been messing with it. So this is an instance where I'd probably want to go back and fix it, but I think I'm going to end up doing a top stitch, so that'll actually correct that. But again, I'm not doing that quite yet. I'm going to get all my seams done first. If your machine seems to be puckering your fabric, you can even give your seam a slight pull as you're sewing it. I have to do that more times than I like to do. so now that I've got my 4 pieces lined up and stitched, now I think I am going to go back and do a top stitch. So the top stitch is just going to help it lay a little bit better. And when you have all the different layers on top of each other, it makes it so the seam allowances don't flip back and forth, so it doesn't get bulky there. So I'm going to be pressing and stitching my seam allowance towards the middle piece. And I'm going to do this from the right side of my fabric. And that way I can make sure that I am going to get this seam pressed as open as possible. Plus, remember, my seam allowance, or my stitch was not perfect on here because of the tension. So I want to be stitching no further than about a 1/16 of an inch, because the further away you get, the more it's going to affect the fit of the cup. So I'm pulling it and I'm top stitching it on the middle side. I'm just taking my time because I want to make sure there's no funny bubbles. And you can see when I do this top stitch, look how amazing. You can see this lines up beautifully. So when we go to sew the next piece, it's going to attach like butter. And then we can come back in here and trim this up. I'm not going to do that at the machine because I don't have the right scissors over here. So I'm just going to continue working on my stitching. So again, I'm going to do this on this side. Now this one's also a little tricky, so we may want to start with your starter fabric because we don't want it to pull my fabric into the machine. This one's a little harder to get right at that 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going to do the best I can. This one may be a little bit further away. But take your time. And my seam allowance is wanting to flip over. So again, I'm using this opportunity because I have that underneath. It makes it easier to control by putting pressure on top. Again, this is coming up right nicely into the neckline. Okay, make sure the seam's not puckering. If it is, just kind of give it a tug, kind of pull that stitch a little bit. This is the time to make those corrections. You can also take it to the iron and steam it and try and pull that seam because we don't want it to have a big crease there at the curve. So this side's a little bit worse. So I'm going to take that over to the iron and try and get that smoother. Okay, so I'm going to do that now on this piece. So we're going to go towards the middle, so it's on this side now. If you notice, I'm coming from the bottom up because I feel that it's a little bit more accurate if we sew in the same direction every single time. That one seemed to do well. My machine doesn't really like the lace, so that's something we're going to have to work on over at the iron. Again, my starter fabric. I think it's a little out of control. Well, as long as it's got something to grab onto. Okay, this time on this side, I'm going to give my seam a little bit of a pull. Because it seems to be wanting to scrunch my fabric up, and I'd rather stretch that seam a little bit for that top stitch. But your machine may behave a little differently, so of course, do only what you need to do with your machine. This one looks a lot better than the other side. It's probably because that first stitch on the other side pulled. Okay. So now I'm going to head back over to the table so we can work on attaching number 3. Okay, so now we have our lace piece here. And you can see that we have several notches here. And so you can see that where this notch is, this is lining up right about here, but the top should line up all the way up to the top. So I'm going to set that here. I'm going to line up my pink. I'm going to pin it at the bottom with my right sides together. And then I'm also going to line up the top of this to the top of the neckline. And I'm going to do a couple pins from the bottom. And then I'm going to go back over to the top and work my way down. Because remember, if there's going to be any ease in this cup, it would be around the apex. So that way, and we don't have any ease, so it's perfect. But this also ensures that we are able to line it up well as we go around that curve. So I've got that piece lined up. Now I can come over here to my purple one. So again, we line that up at the very top. We line this up to the very bottom. Again, we're doing all right sides together. I left all my pins at the sewing machine. Okay, I'm going to pin walking my way up from the bottom. Put about 2 pins in there. And then switch up to the top. And you see we have this nice little curve in here up at the top of the cup. And that gives us a little bit more dimension and a little bit more molding to the top of the breast. So it makes it fit in there nicely. Okay, and then there's the rest. Okay, I have my left side pinned, and I'm going to repeat on the right side. And you see we have a big curve in here, so you're going to have to walk that curve, walk them into each other. And where I'm pinning is at 1/4 of an inch. So if you're pinning way over here, things are not going to line up right, but you got to make sure that where you're pinning is right about that 1/4 of an inch, right where you're going to be sewing it. If you pin way over here, that's not going to do anything. Okay, now we have these pieces all lined up, so we will have pieces 1, 2, and 3 attached. I'm going to take these back over to the sewing machine. I'm going to line them up in the same orientation so we can continue on with our sewing. Okay, so now we're ready to sew the seam. Now I've been sewing from the bottom up, so I'm going to continue with that trend. That way we make sure that everything is pulling to the same direction if there's any pulling. Now remember when we did that first seam, my fabric kind of did a little pulling on it. So I am going to do some counter pulling ever so slightly. So as I'm doing this, I'm just going to give it a slight tug just to put a little tension on the seam. Just because I know that the machine was pulling that seam. And this way it's less to work out. And you can see I'm hardly doing it all. I'm just kind of putting a little pressure on it, making the machine do the work. Okay, right about to where that seam was. So I'm all the way at the end. Now because this stitch goes all the way to the edge of the fabric, well, we can cheat a little bit. We can actually keep this one on here without having to do another one of these. And I'm going to slide this one right in right after it. And that way we keep the pieces, we keep our rights together and our lefts together. And we won't get them mixed up. But this also kind of helps with your overall lining up, getting things into the machine. Sometimes it's just easier to keep sewing with them attached. Now we can come back and clip these apart. But you see, it made it a little bit easier that I wasn't trying to start another stitch and line it up all at the same time. So we can do the same thing here, or we just finish this one up. I said there's a couple different things you can do here, but always whenever you're getting ready to start on that lace, start with your starter fabric. And I'm starting from the bottom, but it's this time you're seeing the other side facing up. But I'm going to still continue what I did before, giving my seam a little bit of a stretch, and it looks like that fabric underneath slid a little bit. But I'm being really careful to keep my edges lined up. So now, just as I did my top stitch for this piece, I'm going to do this one, and I'm also going to stitch this one towards my center front. So it's going to go towards the inner piece now. So I'm doing it from the top. I'm just going to try and line this up the best I can. Remember, close to the edge, about a 1/16 of an inch. Making sure I'm pulling it so there's no bubbles in the seam, because if you end up sewing a bubble into the seam, that means you're losing that space inside the cup. And I know on most clothing that doesn't make a big difference, but when you're working on a bra, every little bit of space is accounted for. Finish that piece, and instead of having to use my starter piece again, we're going to just move on to this one. So you can see I'm kind of rolling up my fabric a little bit so I can get in there, because I'm not worried about what's going on down here yet. I'm only worried about what's getting ready to go through the machine. Okay, so I can clip that. It didn't get eaten, so I can separate it. So I'm going to go back over to the table, keep my lefts and rights separate, and then I'm going to work on trimming down those seam allowances a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to come in here and just be real careful. I probably should have done this in between each one of those stitches, but I got carried away with sewing, and sometimes I get a little distracted. So using a small pair of scissors is ideal, because the big ones can often cut stuff you don't want to have cut. So I'm going to go ahead and get this trimmed down off camera, because you don't need to see how terrible I am at cutting. And then we'll be back for the next step. Now is the time to start assembling our layers together, and we're going to use our power bar. So I'm going to put the lace to the side temporarily, and then I want to look at the wrong sides. So I'm actually going to flip them over here. Wrong sides of my lining. And we want to place our power bar on the wrong side. So this way, it doesn't really matter if it's in this direction or if it's in this direction, because it's going to be completely sandwiched in between the different layers. So I'm going to get this pinned together. So we have basically wrong side to wrong side. And then this, I'm going to walk this around the waistline. And so the power bar is going to be between the lace and between our lining. Okay, so I'm also going to walk this around the armhole, and then we're going to baste these together. Now, if you're really good at pinning, and you can pin and baste 3 layers together, well, you can probably eliminate one of the next steps, but I'm going to do this in 2 steps. So we've got our power bar to make sure we're putting it all together correctly on the inside. I'm going to run over to the machine. I'm going to baste around these edges. And then we'll come back over to assemble the lace pieces on here as well. Okay, I'm going to make sure that my machine is on a basting stitch. So I have this as my largest stitch. Actually, I don't have it as my largest stitch. And then I'm going to stitch around the edges at about 1/8 of an inch, so real close to the edge. And I'm doing it so my stretch fabric is facing up. I feel that it stretches a little bit less when I can control it from the top side. There will be more layers coming in over here. So you can pivot your corners, or you can sew them off the edge, whichever you need to do. And then basting them together at the bottom. Now the power bar does not come all the way over to that peak. It may come close, but don't force it to match. Okay, I'll give myself a little tail so I have a little bit of room to stretch that back out. And then I'm going to come over here and do the same thing. So all the way around the edges. Okay. So I've got these basted together. I'm now going to go back over to the table so we can then work on putting our lace overlay on. Okay, so I'm going to look at my power net side, and I'm now going to take my lace and I am going to sandwich that power bar between the layers. So again, we're going to line these up. We're going to pin them around the edges. So I'll start at my side seam, and I'm going to go down around my waistline. And this is a good idea to try and line up your seams down at the bottom. And that's kind of hard because you've got the power net in between. I'm going to come up through the front of the cup. So you'll notice that I removed my blue painter's tape. I didn't mention that, but we need to make sure that we do that so we don't have any blue painter's tape on the inside. So I removed those pieces from the inside. I'm not too worried about the chalk marks because those will wear away and they're not completely obvious from the outside. But I did remove the blue tape. I had to refilm a tiny little segment because I sewed something wrong, like many of us do. And I omitted removing the paint tape again. So nobody is perfect, including myself. But there is no painter's tape in there, so I'm not sewing anything together. But we have what looks like a really nice piece on the inside and outside. I love how this purple and pink look together. Okay. Line up the straps the best I can. Sometimes with the different layers they grow or they don't grow. So I just want to have them as good as possible. And I'm going to go back and do another basting stitch around the edges just to hold everything together. Now I could easily try and skip some of that, but this is a giant pin cushion right now, and I know I would be stabbing myself if I tried to work around my pinning and to sew the next steps. So I will be back over at the sewing machine doing my basting again. I'm going to start with my starter piece. And again, I still have my basting stitch on. We just need to remember that we need to take off the basting stitch before we do our final sewing. Get that piece off. It doesn't matter if you catch all the layers or not in all spots. This is to keep things together before we do our finishing touches. And I can always come in here and trim some seams down if I need to, because my lace had come a little short when I was pinning. Okay, my strap's starting to turn on me. Got that power net in there, so I'm going to try and kind of push some of that fabric back in there. By the time we get the straps and the elastics done, it will straighten itself back out. So don't be too concerned if it's stretching on you. But because we have different layers going on in here, use something to help you push the fabrics through and keep them lined up. And down at the bottom. Now down here, remember we had a little bit of ease on some of the cups here because the lace stretched a bit. So this is a really good place to take it slow and easy around the edges. And there's some pins all over the place. Okay, so those pieces are all attached. I'm going to just come over here and jump right onto this piece so I don't have to get my starter piece again. Looks so pretty. Okay. all my basting is done. And go back over to the table and see what the next step is. Okay, so I'm keeping them aligned, so I've got my right and left. We're now going to take our back, so we've got that wrong side. We got the wrong side, so we're going to do right sides together at my side seam. So we can see what we're looking at. So we are having a concave and a convex curve here. So pin the top and bottom, and then you can pin the middle. The stretch fabric is nice that it easily folds and molds right into that. Okay, now we're going to stitch both of these at our 1/4 inch, and then we're going to do a top stitch towards the back. And then we will begin working on some of our elastics. Okay, so I'm getting ready to sew my seam, and I am starting with my starter piece. Okay, now at this point, I am going to try and do a back stitch, just because this is a point on the bra that's going to be reinforced, or that needs to be reinforced because it's at the neckline. I'm also going to do the same thing at the bottom over here and do a small little back stitch. Oh, and you know what I did? I sewed with my basting stitch, so I'm going to go and do that again, taking it back to my smaller stitch. Because I've got that still in there, and do this piece. Okay, and then back stitch. And then do my back stitch. We're going to take, so it makes it easy. So if we have all of our seam allowance coming towards the back, then we can come in here and do a top stitch. Kind of stitch it down, just right on the edge, no more than 1/8 inch. And I didn't do a back stitch on this one, it's not really necessary. Over here, I'm going to continue. Take that piece out. Again, my seam allowance towards the back. Now we can trim some of the seam allowance down. I kind of stitched on the wide side, so I don't really have much to trim down. Okay, so it looks like the next part to work on is my center. Okay, so let's see what we're looking at here. So I've got wrong side, wrong side, wrong side, and wrong side. Okay, so we want to actually look at our right sides because we're going to pin our right sides together. So all the right sides facing up, making sure I have the correct orientation. Oop, they're all upside down. So always use your pattern as your reference. Right here is the bottom waistline. This is the neckline. So we're going to have our right sides together. So we're going to be pinning in sewing these pieces along the top. So I'm going to sew here, and then, oops, right sides together. I'm going to sew these pieces together. So it's all of our right sides are together, so our wrong sides are facing out. And I'm going to do the next couple steps over at the sewing machine. Okay. So I'm not doing a back stitch on these ones right now, just because we have a couple stitches we're going to be doing, so it's not as necessary. So if you press them open, and I'm going to do this here with just my nail, because this allows me to get it a little crispy. And I don't have a camera right at my iron. So if we press that open, and then we fold that right on that crease, it gets that seam right on the edge. So again, I will do that over here. So if we press the seam open, we can then press it and fold it right on that seam. So most cup linings, you'll not be able to do this. So this is a special fabric that is really nice for creasing. But I would take this over to the iron if you have an iron available, and that way you can get it nice and crispy. And now I'm going to do a top stitch right on the edge, no more than 1/16 of an inch from the edge. So this might be a good place to do that starter fabric. We'll see if my machine wants to eat this. Sometimes it does. Nope, it didn't. So we're good. We're safe. Okay. Okay, we're now going to place these two seams together. So we now don't have any wrong sides showing. So we're going to line up all 4 of the pieces along this side, but be extra careful that you line up this top edge, the top edge where we have the stitches on it. And everything's going to move on you, so just be careful. Okay, now up at the top, I'm actually You gotta be really careful when you're starting here. So I'm gonna make sure that my needle, I'm gonna get my needle into the fabric right on that fold. So that way I make sure, so I'm getting it in that fold. So those pieces are together before I even drop my foot. And then I'm gonna do a couple stitches forward, a couple stitches back. And that way that should make sure that that comes together right at that seam. We're going to open this seam, and we actually want to press this open. So completely open on that seam. Okay, my seam is pressed open. I pressed it both on this side and on this side. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a wide but short zigzag stitch down the center, and I'm going to do this on the face side just so I can see where I'm stitching. If I sew it on the other side, yes, you know, we can still see where the seam is, but I know my machine does a prettier stitch on the top anyways, so I'd rather the outside of mine look better than the front. So I'm going to go to a very wide, and then I'm going to go down to a kind of short, so wide and short stitch. I'm going to line up the center, and then I'm going to sew all the way down, and I want to stop about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to mark with my sharper pins. I'm going to stop right about here with those pins. And so my machine does a fairly wide stitch. Yours may not be this wide, but mine is at a 5. Makes for a pretty little top stitch. And at the top over here, I'm actually going to just pull that zigzag through to the back and then knot them together, and I'll make it prettier in the back side. And if you have any fabric hanging over, you can trim your seam allowances down. I don't have much left that is showing because my stitch is super wide, but I can get it a little bit trimmed. Okay, and I'm going to baste these edges together just so nothing moves when I go to attach all the pieces together. So the next step we need to do is we need to look at our chart and look at the size that you're working on. So for me, I'm doing the 34G, and this one's for my mom. So I'm looking at this, and it is the neckline elastic 9. And I come down here over to the chart, and number 9, I need to cut 15 3/8 of an inch for my elastic on the neckline. So I'm going to cut 2 of those, and then I'm going to come back over here to the machine and continue working here at the machine. Okay, I'm going to set this over to the side. And we have our elastic pieces. So we have the plush and picot side, So the picot side is going to go towards the strap. And we're going to be sewing it kind of a 1-to-1 right to about this point, right to about to the top of the cup, because we don't want the strap to stretch. And then down towards the bottom, we're going to stretch this to fit. And you're like, well, where is the bottom? Well, you see right about where that power neck comes in, you'll see you had a little bit of an angle, and most of my markings have kind of worn off. But that's right about where, that's right where it needs to end. So you can see it's not a lot you have to stretch, it's just a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to change to a much more narrow zigzag. So not a real wide one. And go back up to about my 2. About my 2.5 is where I have it. And then I'm going to be stitching this down right on the edge. Now again, because this is a little tricky, I'm going to get my starter piece in there. First, make sure that I'm actually stitching with my zigzag. And then we want to be stitching right on the on the edge. So now because my seams aren't really lining up, I'm going to fake this a little bit and line up my elastic to the innermost layer, which is my lace, because we want to make sure that we have a clean finish with the edge of the lace. So I'm lining this up to my lace edge. So what I'm going to do from right about here is I'm going to take and kind of stretch your elastic into place and then just use my fingers as a clip. Until I get right about there, then come back and pull and stretch. Down to the bottom. So again, I'm going to get my decorative picot edge up. We're now ready to add this centerpiece to the cups. So we're going to start at the bottom and we're going to pin this down. And it should come right about where the seam is. It may come, you've got a lot of layers going in there. Just make sure that where it ends on the one side, it's going to end on the other side. Okay, and I'm now going to take and I'm going to zigzag this down. Now, because this area right here is a little tricky because you've got all those layers, I'm going to make sure I use a tool to stitch it down. So do a little back stitch right there. And then make sure we're lining it right to the edges. And get the and I know the elastic's lining up right there because I can kind of see it poking through. Take this side, we're going to let's do the same thing, line it up down to the bottom. Now again, because I do like to all work from one side to the other, I'm going to be stitching with the bulk of my fabric to the right hand side, which is not what I usually like to do. Get my zigzag in there, do a little back stitch on my zigzag, and take that right along my side. Okay, oh, it's looking so pretty. Okay, and then to finish up our necklines, we're going to fold the elastic under and then do our zigzags down the edge. So now I like to do this on the face of the fabric and again my starter piece. This may want to eat my elastic. Okay, so the elastic's flipped to the back. Make sure that nothing gets caught underneath it. Okay, my front is done. So for the next step, I'm going to refer again to the chart for the underarm elastic. We're using the band size 34, so I need to have 2 pieces of underarm elastic measured at 18 inches. So I went ahead and prepared these pieces. And these are going to be stitched around the armhole. Now I'm going to line these up over here at the top. So there's a right side and a wrong side to your elastic. The brushed side should be the side that's facing up. Now if you got your elastic from me, you'll notice that it is actually brushed on both the top and bottom side. So you can feel it and see which way it kind of rolls. And the side that's a little bit rougher that actually rolls, that's actually rolling to the outside. So we're going to be placing the elastic so it kind of cups down. So this side is slightly more brushed. So I'm going to line that up here at the top. And then I'm also going to line this to my center back. And now there's going to be a little bit of stretching. We don't want to stretch underneath the arm. So I'm going to keep this pinned right about here. And we don't want to pin on the upper part of the strap. So I'm going to pin right about here. So right around this curve, this is where we're going to be stretching. And we can do this to the other side, but I'm just going to sew one at a time. Make sure that you do have your stitch still on your zigzag. This elastic is a little bit wider, so I could actually do my zigzag just slightly wider to cover a larger area. But I'm still going to do it at a fairly small zigzag. I have mine at about a 2, 2 1/4. Each machine is calibrated a little differently, so yours just might be different. I like to make sure that the fabric has enough stretch, especially with the elastic. So sometimes the smaller the stitch, the better it will be. Okay. So I want to make sure where I'm lining this up to the edge of my fabric. And we don't want to be stitching on the little decorative edge because we want that to peek through. So we want to line up our zigzags so it's just kind of lining up right to the edge of it. And so I'm not stretching it at all at this point, right about to where I get to the seam. And when I get to the seam, well, I'm going to first get my needle down, and then I'm going to take and slightly stretch this so it stretches around the armhole. And I'm going to line it up and use my fingers as a bit of a clip. So you see I have kind of my side seam didn't line up perfectly. So I'm going to correct that when I'm sewing so we can trim that down. But you see I'm keeping my elastic stretched into the armhole until I get to that point. And then I can come over here and realign and stretch the elastic again until I get up to the strap. And I'm going to keep my elastic stretched as I'm sewing this. Okay. Once I get to the strap, it should not be stretching anymore. If for some reason you do need to stretch it slightly, it's just very, very slightly so we don't end up with any pleats or puckers in here. But it should be a one-to-one lineup. Okay, I'm going to wait to flip it until I've stitched my other elastic to make sure that I'm doing them both identically. So I'm going to see which way it cups. So this side is going to be up because it's cupping down. So now I'm just going to be sewing the same way I did on the other side. Okay, we are at the end. So now we need to flip our elastics to the back. Now because I have this little piece that wasn't even, I'm just going to trim this up a little bit. Nothing else should really be peeking past the elastic. If it is, trim it back. Make sure not to cut your elastic at all, because the integrity of the elastic will be destroyed if you accidentally trim your elastic and not your fabric. Okay, I think everywhere else, right around here I need to trim as well. And then before we flip it, we're just going to take a look at it flipped before we sew it to make sure that we've actually captured all the layers. It's possible that we didn't, especially with all the layers that we're working with. Sometimes things slide out of position. Okay, so I'm just going to go around and turn this so I can inspect to make sure that I have a nice clean edge and that all edges are behind the elastic. That side looks good. I'm going to come over here and do the same thing, just check. Because this is the act of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be folding it back and then stitching again. But it looks like all layers are going to be behind the elastic. Okay, so then we're going to fold the elastic back and I'm going to stitch on top. Now, if you notice, like if I pull it all the way, we'll have more picot edge. You can kind of fix any uneven sewing that you've done by just kind of folding your fabric so it lines up evenly along it. So you can see some of these places it's really wide, and some places I have kind of really narrow. And so I can kind of make some corrections on there by just folding the fabric. Now, because the elastic has already been attached, you may find that you want to slightly stretch your fabric as you're sewing, just so it doesn't pucker your fabric. And so I'm only giving it a slight tug. Just got to get past that center back, because I don't want this to pleat or pucker. So I'm just going to slightly stretch it so it's an even stitch. I'm going to kind of force my fold over a little bit. You see, I'm taking just a little bit at a time. We've got our curve over here, so I'm going to be careful. This you definitely want to be stretching over here, making sure there's no pleats here. So I got about halfway around the curve, and I'm going to come over here. You see you have all this fabric. This is where you can actually stretch your elastic to make sure that where you're stitching it is flat. Okay, coming around. And over here, because I have so many layers, I do not really need to stretch. I have a little bit of pulling, so just make sure it lays flat. Okay, to the end. Okay, that side looks really good. Now I'm going to do it on the same thing on this side. So folding this back. And sometimes getting it started, this is where that starter piece would actually be helpful, because you can give it a tug. Sometimes with all these layers, it's a little bit tricky. So you can see what I'm doing is I'm grabbing my threads, so I didn't trim them all off. So I can just pull the threads a little bit to get it through the machine, because sometimes it just doesn't want to go through the machine at the beginning of the stitch, like which happened back here. Now this is going to be completely covered with another elastic, so I'm not too concerned about the startings and endings. Okay. And trim our threads. And I'm actually going to trim this tip. Okay, this side looks good. Okay, so now the next step we are working on is going to be your band elastic. So I'm going to set this to the side, and we are going to pull out our band elastic. And I'm going to look at the chart. So you see that we have another chart over here that indicates the length of the elastic. This one is the 34, so I need to cut 15.5 inches, 2 pieces. So I have those pieces right here. Then we're going to line them up, overlapping them so they're at a 90 degree. And we're going to be stitching these 2 corners together. Now this is decorative on the one side and plush on the back. So we'll have to be really careful and cautious of how we line this up when we're attaching it to the bra. In the meantime, I'm going to do a little zigzag stitch here and here. So I'm going to go back to a slightly smaller zigzag from the second one I did, kind of closer to the one I did on the picot for the neckline. And I'm going to start stitching on the elastic over here, just so I have a head start, because I'm going to have to take this pin out relatively quickly. So I'm going to start at maybe, so we're right on the edge, and I'm going to use my tool to line this up, making sure that everything feeds in. And you can go all the way to the corner, and we can pivot, or you can do this in 2 separate stitches. And I'm going to stitch just past it to make sure everything's tacked down. Okay, so now I'm going to fold this upside down, And we should have made sure that we have about 1/4 of an inch unstitched right here. So it looks like I may have gotten a little carried away, so I'm going to clip away a couple stitches so we have that 1/4 of an inch that opens up. Now I stopped my zigzag in the right place, I just didn't stop my straight stitch. So I'm just going to take a couple stitches away so we have a 1/4 of an inch open here at the end. And then I'm going to line this up so we have our right sides together. So the right side of my waistband is going to come right here. So this is going to be a little tricky. I'm going to get a pin. So I'm lining this up to kind of where the tip is, because we're going to have to pivot right at that corner. And then I'm going to take and I'm going to kind of fold the waistline to this point and pin that in place just to where that overlap is. And we can also do that on this side. Now, I like to be extra cautious when I'm doing something like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to do a quick baste right here just to get this side down from that center bit right on the edge. So I still have my zigzag in. I'm going to stitch this right on the edge because I want to make sure I don't have any weird pleating. And so I'm just trying to attach this to about where the overlap is on one side. I've got a pin in there I've got to take out. And so if you do this in 2 steps, you're more likely to get it correct. And it's easier to change if we need to. So now I can pivot to this side. Maybe like, wow, that's tricky. Yes, it is very tricky. And so now I'm going to start stitching on this side. Now I'm doing that on the purple side so I can see what I'm doing. Ideally, you go from the center out, but I know that when I don't see the fabric that's folded, I am more likely to make mistakes. So let's get this down to that corner, and then we can double check it, and then we can go all the way around if it is correct. Okay. So that looks pretty good. I'm quite happy with how that turned out. So I am going to end up stitching over this area again, and I'm going to do it with a slightly shorter stitch because I want to make sure that I have enough stretch around here. So I'm going to continue pinning, and this should actually go straight to my center back. So I'm going to line this up so I've met my center back. And we shouldn't really have any stretching. It should actually fit 1-to-1. And so if you're not lined up perfectly at one of the seams, you want to line it up to the shorter of the seams because our seam allowance here is really small. So if we are lining it up to the outside edge, like right here where I have this little bump, it's actually not going to fit right. I kind of stretch that a little bit. So you don't need to be stretching your elastic at all. It should just fit edge to edge. And if for some reason you do need to, it's probably because something stretched a little bit. And if you are going to pull it at all, do make sure it's just underneath the cup itself. Okay, I've got the one side done. I'm going to come over here. Okay, so I've got it all pinned down, and I'm going to be stitching all along it. Now you can do it with this up or with this down. So I'm going to do this with the bra piece facing up because we have so much more bulk and it's too easy to let it slide underneath the needle and then you're seam ripping. So you don't really want to be doing that. So I'm going to be doing my stitch a little bit on the shorter side because we need to keep it at about 2.5 wide. And I think that's about what I have it at right over here. And so this is a part right here at the end. I'm going to do my starter piece. Okay, so that when I get this started, maybe my pin under there, right to the edge. And we have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance here. So the stitch is about 1/8 of an inch wide. So we have about 1/8 of an inch off the edge that we can still have kind of lining up. So I'm lining up my... Now you can use a pin to help line things up and get it through. I like this little tool. It's super handy. I'll sometimes use a screwdriver. But what it does is it keeps your hands out of the way, especially when you need to get into tight places, because it will slide right underneath the foot. Okay, because where we have our pins, everything's a little bit bulky, so I have to take out my pin before I get over here, make sure we get things lined up. Now, if you need to pull your elastic slightly in order for this to go in, you can do that, because we don't want the elastic to pleat underneath. We don't want the fabric. And so I'm making sure that the elastic is lined up to the edge of my fabric. About right up to my back up to where I had started this. So back up to about where the V is. And so now I'm just kind of reinforcing where we sewed that before. And making sure that this center front does not get pulled up into anything. I'm walking it to the corner. I'm pivoting, making sure I'm keeping all of that excess fabric over here in the middle because we don't want any weird pleats. But we corrected that. We made sure that we didn't do that by sewing that in 2 spaces. Okay. I'm going to have to pull my elastic ever so slightly right around here. We're just going to inspect, make sure that there is no funny pleats. We've got the band in there. Everything looks fabulous. Okay, now to finish the waistband, we're just going to take and do a zigzag top stitch on the bra side. And we can start with our starter piece again. I know this is looking a little bit ragged, but that's what it's there for. Make sure we use it to make sure that we've got the right stitch on there. And so this way I can kind of get this started so I'm not forcing too many things all at once. Okay, got that down. Okay. So if you do need to stretch it to keep it from pleating and puckering, you can do that. But in general, you should just be able to run this through 1-to-1. And you'll notice I am doing it on the right side of the garment, just because I want to make sure that what we see on the outside looks nice, especially since I'm using contrasting thread. I want it to look nice. So I'm stitching kind of right on the edge, making sure that I am stitching that elastic down. I'm going to walk it right about here until I get right to that center on the furthest most part of that zigzag. Oops. I'm going to do one more zigzag this way, and then I can start pivoting. I just don't want to be stitching on the band itself. Okay. So the next step after this is we want to look at a couple things. We want to look at our hook and eye. I'm going to line up my hook and eye against my center back, and it's possible that I took up a little bit more than what I wanted to. So we have a little bit of space here. So when I actually attach my strap elastic, I want to make sure it comes up all the way to the top, so this will be completely enclosed. So for me, that means that I've got about a 1/4 of an inch overlap. Yours may line up perfectly, and if for some reason you end up using a smaller hook and eye, we would want to trim this down to fit, and then we can line this on the edge. But since mine's coming up a little bit on the short side, I'm going to have to compensate and make up so this finished amount equals the amount of the hook and eye. But before we can do that, we need to work on assembling our strap. So if you look at your set of instructions, there is the strap elastic lengths. And so for the 34, I have 12 1/8 inch. So I went ahead and prepped 2 strap pieces in that length. We need 2 rings and 2 slides. We're going to take our slide, we're going to go with the shiny side up through the one side, over that center bar, and back through the other side, leaving about 1 inch at the end. Do that on here. So shiny side up, up through the one side, over that center bar, and pulling it so we have about 1 inch. Now what we can do is we can fold this back, and then we can do a little stitch on here. Now the cleanest way to do this would be to actually do a small zigzag that actually covers the edge of that raw edge. But this part is going to be hidden, so it's not as important. I'm going to do my little back stitch right here. But this way it keeps it from unraveling. And then I like to go back a couple times. And what we can do is, remember how I like to finish one stitch and start another one, so we're not actually starting with anything hanging off the edge. Okay, I'm now going to come over to this side. I'm going to do my little back stitch over the 2 edges. Okay, and I'm going to come back. And I can clip them apart. So if you are using matching thread, you won't see the big black stitches on there. So you're going to have your shiny side. You're going to go through your ring. And then once you've got the ring on there, you're going to go up through one side. So the shiny side is facing out. And then you're going to bring that back down through to create the rest of your strap. So again, we're going to go, so I've got my shiny side facing up. We're now going to take, so we're going to go, so I'm still looking at my shiny side. It goes up through the ring, or up through the slide, and back down through the slide. So we now have our 2 straps assembled. And I'm going to look at both of these pieces. And I'm just going to compare, because it could be that one might be more equal than the other. And so I want this to line up. So I am going to take my pin and just kind of get that pinned right there. On the other side, I don't know if I'm going to have the same issue or not. I may not. And it looks like I do. So again, I'm going to take this, so I line it up so it'll come up to the top of that hook. And this could have been because of my cutting, it could have been because of my sewing. It doesn't matter at this point, but what we're doing is we're correcting at this point. So once we have that pinned, we actually want to take, and we're going to kind of force this to go straight. Now, so because I have, this kind of starts here about halfway, we can take and run this halfway all the way, and then we can do a zigzag on one side. If yours comes all the way up to the top, then you'll run 2 rows of zigzags, once on the outside, once on the inside. Now I could do a combination of that by actually pulling this all the way to the outside edge, run a zigzag in there, and run a zigzag on this side for visual. So I think I'm going to do that so it will look correct on the outside. So you can see how I have that in here. So it's going to be coming a little bit short here. And as we're sewing, I'm going to start on this side. I'm going to take that pin out. I'm going to do my little back stitch first. And then I'm going to, since I pinned the top part, I'm just going to pull this piece straight. So I didn't have that curve completely, so I'm actually kind of removing some of that curve. But we can force it over a little bit more. This is really just so it all fits well at the center back. And come all the way up here. Okay, now I'm at the top. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pivot across, so that way I make sure that this top part is attached. And walk it there, and then I can come back on the other side. Now, if yours lines up perfectly, then it's going to look great on the inside. Mine does not line up perfectly on the inside, but it will still look perfect on the outside. So we can take a peek at what the inside looks like. Because I remember I extended this over to this point. I can also clip a little bit of that elastic right there. And now that's completely secured on that side. We can do something similar over here. So if I want to have this lined up all the way to this edge, so I'll be kind of faking that shape a little bit, because it makes it for a nice reinforced seam at the top. So sewing from this direction over is going to be a little trickier because I don't have the same leverage I do from the other side. So I'm going to just put another pin in here just to make sure it doesn't move out of place. Because now what I have to do is I have to put the bulk of the fabric on the inside of the machine, which I'm not crazy about doing because I have a tendency to get it. I feel like things get a little bit lost. Okay, so I'm going to do a little back stitch. I got to be really careful over here that I am stitching on my power net around this curve, because remember I had to go right to the edge. Okay, I think I'm past the difficult part. So now I can just take and continue up the side of the strap elastic. Okay, come up to the top of my band, walk it. Now you want to be careful that where you actually put the needle down to pivot, it's going to be in the right place. So for this side, I'm making sure my needle is on the right hand side. When I was doing the other piece, I made sure it was on the left hand side. So when I did my pivot, it is going to the right direction. And I go across this way. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot again this way, and this time I'm going down the other side of the elastic. Okay. Let's take a look. Should be pretty secure in there. And so this side and this side, they look a little different, but you know what? They're going to finish up perfectly at our center back. So I'm going to clip this, clip my backs up. And then I'm going to change my stitch back to a straight stitch. And I'm just going to do this as a basting right now. I'm going to open up my hooks and eyes. So open up the eyes and it's on this side. Now we can slide this in and then I can tuck this over. And this one's going to be a little bit easier than the hook side. So I'm trying to pin it in place. When you get to the hook side, it's a little bit more complicated because you don't have as much room to work in. So I'm just going to baste this down. And what I would recommend is being able to offset the needle on your machine if you can. If you can't, it makes it a little bit more challenging. So I'm offsetting it. So I'm moving the needle over to the outside edge so I don't accidentally stitch on my hardware. Now check to make sure that that is in there good. Everything is enclosed. So I'm happy with that. I can then come back and change this back to a small stitch. I'm going to do this even smaller. I'm going to do this one about 1.5 millimeters in length. And then a kind of a 2.5 width. And then what we can do is I'm going to have to put this back to the regular center zigzag. And this is where you got to be careful in case you get really close to the metal. So over here at the top, I'm going to be stitching right off the edge, right about where that last column of eyes starts. So I'm going to be stitching off the edge. I'm going to do a little back stitch there, right there. I'm going to do a little back stitch right there because that's a little point of irritation sometimes at those corners. And then I'm going to come down and zigzag over the edge. And you can do this with a much smaller stitch. My machine is not as consistent. Okay. I'll do a little back stitch just because I'm going over that corner. And sometimes that'll help with any irritation you might get from hooks and eyes. Okay. And of course, matching thread will make it look a whole lot nicer. That looks like it. So that's attached in there. Now, one thing to note, if you are left-handed, there is no reason why you cannot switch which side your hooks and eyes are on. So I'm going to do this because I am right-handed. This goes on this side, and we're going to have our hooks on this side. Now I'm going to just kind of trim this piece up a little bit. Right here, just got to trim out that corner. And this side, we're going to now flip and look at the back side of this. So here, I'm opening this up. You're like, oh, I didn't know I did that. They're just fuse cuts, so you can open them up. This is where we'll want to do a basting. So get out of your zigzag, go back to basting, and we definitely have to offset our needle on this one. I'm going to do this on the other side because I have to get as close as I can over here. And so line this up so the hooks are facing the back. Okay, this looks like it's in a good position. I'm going to see if I can do a zigzag on here. I don't know if my machine will allow me to get that close, but I am going to try. I have to basically realign this. Okay, so we are on the inside. So I'm right on the edge. I'm going to do right along the edge so that it helps with irritation. Okay. And since it's already basted down, it's being held in place. And another part about this that gets so tricky is that we're now having to sew on the back side. So we can't really see what's happening on the right side because if we flip it over, those hooks can get stuck in the feed dogs. So we're kind of taking a risk that the other side looks good. Whoops, and I think I can do one more stitch in that direction. Then come over here. Okay, so I've got that zigzagged on. And take a look at the other side. And it looks fairly good. My basting stitches don't look great, so I could probably go in and remove that basting row. And so our center backs are all ready. So the last step we have to do is get our strap through the ring and close it. So we're going to want to pass this through by about an inch. And you've got a lot of layers going on right here. So I'm going to go through that ring and fold it back by about an inch. And then just double check before you sew it together that you didn't twist anything and you don't have any straps going on backwards or inside out. Okay, that's looking good. Okay, then I'm going to come to the back side, and here we can also do a zigzag, and I'm going to keep it at that smaller length. And if you are careful, you can actually go right along that raw edge you have and make a beautiful finish so you don't have anything raw coming out. So I'm just stitching across, and then I'm going to go all the way, back stitch all the way across. Okay, and then I can trim up any excess there. Do my other side. Trim anything extra. Okay, and let me see, was there anything around the band that I needed to clip up? Let's see. Got a few places where some of my fabric peeked through. So just basically clean it up. Make sure you don't trim your elastic because we don't want to be clipping that. Here is where that band was uneven. So just be really careful when you're going in and cleaning things up, because the last thing you want to be doing is clipping your finished garment, which has happened many, many times for both myself and I'm sure some of you as well. So let's give this a